Jesus, who met hurting crowds with both word and presence, a model for ministry that heals and astonishes. His touch restored bodies, but his compassion restored dignity. His miracles were not performances. They were encounters where heaven bent low to meet human pain. This is the image that frames the entire story of Aimee Semple McPherson, a ministry built on presence, passion, and the longing to bring the divine into the wounds of ordinary people. Snapshot: Aimee is charismatic preacher, faith healer, media pioneer, a woman who filled auditoriums, stirred national headlines, and inspired both devotion and controversy. Her public ministry was electric. Crowds claimed healings, the sick surged to the stage, and newspapers chased every move she made. Yet behind the platform lights lived a private story, marked by exhaustion, pressure, and one of the most mysterious disappearances in American religious history. Central tension to name: the hunger for signs and the cost of spectacle, why people long for visible demonstrations of power, and how that longing shapes both leaders and communities. Crowds often demand a hero, and leaders, in their attempt to meet the need, can become trapped in roles too heavy for a single person to bear. One spiritual anchor: the Spirit as the fragile, sanctifying presence that distinguishes true power from performance. Without the Spirit's refining influence, even genuine gifts can drift into self-exhaustion, overexposure, or manipulation, not by malice, but by the weight of expectation and the strain of constant demand. Questions this video will answer: what inner needs drove Aimee's ministry? What psychological and social forces produced both genuine restoration and dangerous blind spots? What patterns formed the miracles, the fame, and the eventual disappearance? And what lessons should modern leaders learn if they desire impact without sacrificing integrity? Promise to the viewer: this video will expose the emotional, relational, and institutional patterns behind the miracles and the mystery, offering practical wisdom to help you pursue influence without repeating the same pitfalls. Before we continue, comment below the country and city you're watching from. Hidden pain: the deep human ache Aimee met, isolation, illness, social dislocation, and how that creates demand for immediate visible relief. In the early 20th century, medical limitations, financial instability, and waves of social upheaval left millions feeling abandoned by both institutions and family structures. Aimee stepped into that vacuum, offering something people rarely encountered: attention, touch, and a promise that God saw them personally. Crowds were not only seeking physical healing, they were seeking acknowledgement, belonging, and a sense that their suffering mattered. This convergence of personal hunger and public need created an atmosphere where miracles were not merely hoped for, they were expected. Psychological driver: charismatic leaders often mirror congregational yearning. The leader's perceived authority becomes emotional currency that buys trust and miracles. Aimee's confidence, her dramatic preaching style, and her physical presence created a feedback loop. As crowds perceived her as a vessel of supernatural power, their belief intensified, and her influence grew. This dynamic does not negate the possibility of genuine spiritual encounters, but it reveals how deeply emotional ecosystems shape what people experience. Leaders like Aimee become symbols, and their voices carry weight not only because of theology, but because they give form to the collective longing. Counterintuitive insight: miracles can be both real and socially amplified. Collective expectation changes perception and physiological stress responses, so miracle moments are co-created. In high-intensity environments, the human body releases chemicals that reduce pain, increase mobility, and heighten emotion. This means crowds may witness legitimate changes while also interpreting ambiguous or temporary shifts through the lens of hope. Aimee's gift was her ability to harness this convergence: spiritual expectation, psychological need, and social unity, shaping moments that felt transcendent for those present. This blend of grace and group psychology explains why some testimonies endured while others faded. Practical consequence: teach audiences to discriminate, create litmus tests, follow-up care, verifiable testimony, long-term change, rather than judging by initial spectacle alone. Miracles that hold over time must merge spiritual transformation with sustainable restoration. When communities track outcomes, integrate medical evaluation, and provide discipleship, they honor genuine works of God while reducing the risk of exaggeration. Discernment is not unbelief, it is stewardship. Leaders who build systems of verification protect the vulnerable and strengthen credibility. Spectacle draws crowds, but structure preserves truth. Metaphor: a magnet in a field. Public expectation magnetizes experience. The magnet can orient iron filings, lives, but can also attract rust. Aimee's ministry gathered thousands, organizing them into movement and momentum. But the same magnetic pull also drew skepticism, controversy, and unhealthy dependence on her persona. Understanding this dual nature helps modern believers honor the beauty of God's work, while recognizing the human forces that can distort it. Pain point: the modern appetite for viral signs. Aimee's media savvy turned healing into headline. The crowd wanted sensation. At a time when newspapers were the primary gateway to the world, editors knew that miracle stories sold faster than political updates. Aimee understood the power of print, photography, and radio before most religious leaders did. Her messages traveled beyond the walls of revival tents, forming a national stage where expectancy multiplied. This hunger for spectacle wasn't simply superficial. It reflected a population searching for hope, novelty, and a break from the monotony of daily struggles. People flocked to anything that promised escape, even if temporary. Mechanism: media attention amplifies feedback loops. More attention, larger crowds, stronger social proof, more reported miracles. This cycle reinforces itself. When crowds grow, people feel safer believing boldly. When stories circulate, individuals reinterpret personal experiences through a miracle framework. As the platform expands, the leader becomes not just a preacher, but a public phenomenon. Aimee's rise parallels today's viral dynamics. Emotional content spreads quickly, and the audience becomes part of the narrative. Media exposure doesn't just document the event, it reshapes the event, fueling further intensity and expectation. Surprising flip: amplification can mask fragility. The louder the platform, the weaker the private structures. Accountability, pastoral care. Attention creates pressure. Pressure breeds secrecy, and secrecy often hides pain. The very machinery that amplified Aimee's ministry also magnified her vulnerabilities. Public adoration can insulate leaders from correction, leaving them without voices bold enough to challenge unhealthy patterns. The weight of maintaining a flawless image slowly erodes relational support and spiritual equilibrium. Fame multiplies opportunities but equally multiplies risks. Practical tool: demand structural transparency in ministries, documentation, third-party corroboration, medical referrals, and aftercare systems. When communities insist on clarity, the burden no longer rests solely on the charisma or claims of a single leader. Healthy structures create integrity. They also protect the credibility of legitimate testimonies. If a healing is genuine, it endures scrutiny. If it is misunderstood or misinterpreted, follow-up processes clarify reality without harming individuals. Transparency becomes a safeguard against both exaggeration and exploitation. Analogy: a microphone that brings a whisper to a stadium. What is amplified may be true and incomplete at once. Media can project sincerity or distortion, depending on the context and motives at play. The microphone doesn't discriminate, it magnifies. Aimee's life shows how magnification can elevate authentic faith while simultaneously elevating unresolved human complexity. Understanding the amplification loop helps modern leaders navigate visibility with discernment, humility, and safeguards that preserve integrity even amid influence. Emotional undercurrent: leaders under constant demand accumulate shame, secrecy, and performance pressure. These create crisis points. For someone like Aimee, adored by thousands and scrutinized by thousands more, the emotional stakes were enormous. Every sermon, every healing, every radio broadcast carried expectations she never had room to decline. When a leader becomes the center of spiritual momentum, the weight of being the miracle worker can slowly erode the private self. Exhaustion turns into anxiety, anxiety turns into dread, and dread eventually seeks escape, sometimes dramatic, sometimes misunderstood. Cognitive dynamics: when public identity ties to infallibility, a single private failure multiplies into narrative catastrophe. Cognitive dissonance drives either confession or cover-up. The mind tries to protect the fragile inner self by creating alternate explanations or withdrawing into silence. In Aimee's case, the disappearance became a storm of competing narratives: kidnapping, collapse, scandal, exhaustion, mystery. The human mind under crushing pressure often acts not logically but defensively. When someone lives inside a role the public demands, crisis becomes almost inevitable. Counterintuitive reality. Disappearance events don't always signal guilt. They can be escape, a staged pause, a mental health collapse, or a mixture. Motives are complex. People rarely break under a single emotion. They break under the collision of emotions: fear, shame, loss, unmet longing, relational strain. The public assumes clarity, but private pain is rarely clean or linear. Aimee's disappearance became an American spectacle precisely because the audience didn't want nuance. They wanted certainty. But authentic leadership requires humility to acknowledge that sometimes the strongest public figures are privately drowning. Applied safeguard, normalize accountability and sabbatical rhythms for leaders. Mandate rest, counseling, and transparent crisis response protocols. A system that protects the leader protects the community. Regular retreats, counseling sessions, shared leadership, and crisis guidelines allow the emotional temperature to cool before pressure becomes unbearable. Sabbaticals, far from being indulgent, are tools of sustainability. Leader care is not optional. It is preventative medicine for the soul. Image. Reputation like a glass dome. One crack refracts the whole structure. Better to have internal braces before cracks appear. A reputation built on charisma alone is dangerously brittle. Strength comes from hidden reinforcements: confession, community, limits, vulnerability, healthy rest, and accountability. Without these internal braces, even a small fracture can distort everything beneath the dome. Aimee's story is not a warning against greatness, but a warning about greatness without guardrails. Spiritual longing. Audiences prize gift demonstration. Leaders prize fruit and anointing. But formation, the slow interior work of character, humility, confession, and self-awareness, often lags behind gifting. Aimee's ministry revealed this tension vividly. People flocked to her services because they believed in her spiritual power, but few understood the disciplines, wounds, and contradictions behind the platform. Giftedness can attract crowds long before character is mature enough to sustain the weight of influence. The gap between the two becomes a silent fault line that can rupture when pressure builds. Neuroscience note: repeated public triumphs without reflection can harden reward circuits, dopamine reinforcement, increasing temptation toward spectacle rather than stewardship. When applause becomes a predictable reward, the brain learns to seek it. Without intentional grounding practices, solitude, accountability, lament, real rest, the spiritual leader can become addicted to public affirmation. The result is subtle but dangerous. Ministry shifts from service to performance, from calling to identity, from worship to audience response. Without formation, gifts become tools of self-protection rather than channels of grace. Surprising pivot. Sustained ministry effectiveness depends less on charisma and more on practices that alter the brain and heart. Confession, lament, restitution, mentoring. These practices strengthen emotional regulation, deepen humility, and rebuild trust structures that fame erodes. Formation is not glamorous. It is often painful, slow, and unseen. But it is what keeps a leader grounded when their influence grows. Aimee's story highlights what happens when gifting outruns formation. The cracks widen until the interior weight can no longer be hidden. Practical discipline. Implement a threefold rule. 1. Every public claim matched with a private care plan. 2. Mentoring covenant with peers or elders who ask hard questions. 3. Periodic external audits of ministry practices to ensure transparency. These disciplines guard both the leader and the community. They prevent emotional isolation, reinforce integrity, and structure the ministry around truth rather than image. Leadership becomes safer when the systems around it are honest and interdependent. Metaphor: a river that produces fish, gifts, but needs healthy banks, character, to keep flowing. Cut the banks and the river floods or dries. Spiritual gifts create beauty, nourishment, and movement, but without the boundaries of formation, they become destructive. Formation shapes the riverbed. It keeps the water flowing in a life-giving direction. Gifts inspire people. Formation protects them. Both are necessary for a ministry that endures storms without collapsing. Core problem: many miraculous encounters end as emotional spikes unless converted into habits and systems of change. Aimee's healing meetings were electrifying, People reported transformation, relief, and restored hope. But without follow-up, even the most powerful experiences can evaporate. Human beings return to old patterns unless supported by new structures. A miracle moment can open a door, but only intentional discipleship, community, and practical support can help someone walk through it. The crowd celebrates the breakthrough, yet the real miracle is the long, slow restoration that unfolds afterward. Mechanisms for permanence: community integration, therapy referrals, vocational support, and discipleship pathways embed miracle experiences into genuine life trajectories. Emotional transformation becomes behavioral transformation when the person is not left alone after the encounter. Neuroscience shows that life change solidifies through repetition and relational reinforcement. A healed person who re-enters an unhealthy environment without guidance is vulnerable to relapse, emotionally, spiritually, or physically. Aimee's story highlights both the power of revival and the fragility of healing without sustained support. Counterintuitive tactic: slow, practical pathways, mentorship, small groups, accountability, skill training are often more miraculous in the long run than single dramatic interventions. A sudden recovery may be impressive, but a life rebuilt over months is far more transformative. Miracles that last rarely look like fireworks. They look like consistency, stability, and renewed purpose. Audiences often crave spectacle, but God often works through structure. Faith that seeks sustenance over sensation matures into resilience instead of emotional dependency. Actionable plan: design a post-miracle pipeline. Verify the claim, provide medical, psychological check when appropriate, assign a mentor, track 6 to 12-month outcomes. This protects both the person and the ministry. It prevents confusion, exaggeration, and emotional harm. It strengthens trust and credibility. It honors the healed individual with real care instead of momentary attention. When ministries build such systems, miracles no longer stand alone. They become the doorway to long-term restoration and community flourishing. Analogy: a transplant requires post-op care. Without follow-up, the operation fails. Miracles are spiritual transplants. The body, emotional, relational, spiritual, must be nurtured so the new life can stabilize. Without aftercare, the very miracle intended to give life can be overwhelmed by an unprepared environment. True healing is not an event. It is a journey. Synthesis: Aimee Semple McPherson's life teaches two simultaneous truths. First, God can work powerfully through bold, public ministry that reaches the masses with compassion and conviction. Miracles did occur, real, moving, and transformative. But second, human systems and human hearts often remain unfinished. Spectacle can outpace structure. Gift can run ahead of character. Crowds can be healed while the leader quietly collapses. Miracles alone do not guarantee maturity, justice, or long-term change. The story of Aimee is not a dismissal of the miraculous. It is a reminder that the miraculous must be supported by integrity, accountability, and emotional grounding. Ethical takeaway: celebrate genuine restoration, but insist on structures that protect the vulnerable, support leaders, and turn moments of power into sustainable transformation. Healing is holy work, and holy work requires both spiritual fire and responsible frameworks. Ministries must develop habits of verification, follow-up, reporting, rest cycles, and pastoral oversight. Audiences must learn discernment, not chasing spectacle, but seeking fruit, and leaders must cultivate humility, therapy, mentorship, and sabbatical rhythms to avoid the collapse that comes when pressure becomes unbearable. 3 practical commitments for viewers and ministries. Require verifiable follow-up for all healings and testimonies. Never rely solely on the moment. Track long-term outcomes. Institute regular leadership sabbaticals and counseling, recognizing that burnout and secrecy destroy more ministers than false doctrine ever will. Create accessible reporting and restorative protocols for relational, financial, or spiritual harm. Transparency is protection, not punishment. Final image: power without formation is like lightning striking a tree, briefly brilliant, often leaving the root charred. But power shaped by character is like steady rain that nourishes an entire field. Let our worship seek not only lightning, but the slow, patient root work that sustains life. Question to leave with the audience: do we want miracles as spectacle, or as invitations to build the slow, costly systems that make restoration real and lasting?